We all know the issue in hundreds of neighborhoods across the country. We've all seen in the media this idea of the lack of nutritious, affordable, and high-quality foods, particularly in low-income and communities of color. And so we know that there is a disparity that exists in the U.S. when it comes to food access. And that's been highlighted in recent years. We also have seen that in our work. Before I came back to Chicago, I was at University of Michigan, so we worked in Detroit. And so we interviewed a person in Detroit about 3 or 4 years earlier, and then in Chicago and Inglewood. And so in Inglewood, a resident said, you go all the way out to the suburbs where the white people live at, and you find everything. It's even better, a better variety in chain supermarkets when you go to their stores. There's a difference. A Detroit resident indicated, you got to go all the way out to the suburbs now to get some decent food, and therefore it's not available to us in this community. By the time you get to that store and get some fresh fruits and vegetables, you're going to pass 30 fast food joints and about 100 liquor stores. And so although we've made this somewhat an academic exercise, people in the community were very aware of this issue before the term food desert came about. Actually, food desert came about from a community resident in the UK in a study that was conducted by Steve Cummings. And so really we've been able to take those words and apply it internationally, even though researchers have sort of taken that term and it's become a certain definition with that term, we know that it's emerged from the community. And so what are other issues that we need to address or that are on the table? And the other is food insecurity. How many people have seen the food insecurity data that was recently released by the Chicago Food Depository? And these are community-specific rates. And so when we talk about the prevalence of food insecurity in Chicago and in the wider Cook County area, we see that we talk about food deserts, but we also have these same communities that suffer from high food insecurity. So when you look at Inglewood, 31%, North Lawndale, it means that people are concerned that they may run out of money to buy more food. Ford Heights, 50.5% of residents in that community have been reported to be food insecure. So, and that's an issue. So we talk about geographic access, but we also need to think about other factors that exist. And so I really like this quote from Virchow, who is the father of social medicine, talking about the social production of health and illness. Do we not always find that disease of the populace traceable to defects in society? So when we look at food deserts, we're actually thinking about outcomes, not root causes. And King's philosophy was very consistent and provides a framing for when we think about food access or any issue. One of the main parts of King's philosophy is the triple evils: racism, poverty, and militarism. And so this framework can be applied to food deserts in our food desert conversation as well. So, and one reason why King's philosophy is so relevant is because this is not a new issue. Not even in the academic literature is the idea of disparities in food access a new issue. In the 1960s and late 70s in the marketing literature, Sexton in 1971 published a study comparing the cost of food to blacks and whites in a survey. These studies, also known as sort of the ghetto grocery surveys, really dealt with disparities in shoppers. Even the U.S. House of Representatives Government Operations Committee in 1968 raised this as an issue of consumer problems of the poor, supermarket operations in low-income areas, and the federal response. So this is in 1968. It's 2011. And so even though now we're really moving forward with solutions and we think it's a new issue, it's actually not a new issue. it's been well framed for many years, both within the community as well as, at least in some segments of the literature. So I want to talk about a model, Kaplowitz model of ghetto consumer problems when we move towards solutions. In 1963, the same year that we had the March on Washington, which was August 28, 1963, Kaplowitz proposed two sets of interrelated factors causing some consumers to be disadvantaged in the marketplace in relation to others. So he talked about personal characteristics of consumers. Oh, sorry. Oh, this is really odd. Okay. So my model is gone, but I can explain it. That's what happens when you teach, you have to roll with it. So he talked about several factors that could disadvantage consumers. Some of these are direct factors and some are indirect factors. So he talked about both less income as a direct factor, as well as self-perceptions of powerlessness within communities. Market structure variables were added later to talk about food chains and this idea that inner city consumers must patronize a fragmented marketing system operating at low volume with high operating costs, insufficient capital, and poor management. So, let's see if it comes. Okay. So, in a similar vein, Petroff in 1970 conducted a survey with respondents about the evaluation of supermarket functions. And I think why this is so important, much of our current food desert conversation has been on produce. It's been on getting fresh fruits and vegetables into communities without a discussion about the context. A store or other types of options bring more to communities than just produce. They bring other food items, but they also bring a value of money. They bring enough parking spaces. They bring what kind of services those stores are going to provide to the community. Are they going to sponsor a baseball team? Are they going to be able to give grants to community residents? Are you able to maximize your food assistance benefits within those stores? And so this is 1970 that these studies were conducted, and you have similar results to what we're talking about right now. So where do we go from here? That's the question on the table. But the real question, when you think about the length of time that communities have been dealing with this issue, is what are we going to do about it, and are we really ready to do it? King talks about 6 steps of nonviolent social change. And in this, he talks about information gathering. Really, how do we understand the facts? Education, are we ready to educate ourselves about the issues and be knowledgeable about the human consequences and the unjust situation? Are we ready to make a personal commitment? It takes some level of negotiation with all of the players, but if negotiation fails, King talks about leading to direct action, where we need to contest issues and conditions. And then we always need to deal with reconciliation, which is the mandatory step of a campaign when the opponents and proponents celebrate the victory and provide joint leadership in implementing change. So I have just a few issues for consideration, and then I know we want to move to a discussion. But the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that stores coming into the community are not doing the community a favor. It really is a joint partnership. Communities are buying goods, and stores and other facilities are providing goods. It's an exchange. It's not a social service like a community hospital. So food is a basic human right. So if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, Article 25, everyone has a right to the standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services. So this is a basic human right. I think the second point that I would like to make is that we really need to acknowledge the complexity. We talk about food deserts as a geographic solution, but we really have to move beyond that to consider social and economic structures that affect food access. So Dr. Blair Lewis talked about social determinants of health, and when you think about social determinants of food access, these factors are consistent. We think about income, employment, transportation, housing, education, and we can't forget this idea of racial and cultural and historical oppression in the context of food access when we're thinking about solutions. Many people have proposed a different definition in contrast to food deserts, this idea of food justice or food sovereignty or community food security, which was developed by Mike Hamm in Michigan, where the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown, produced, transported, accessed, and eaten are shared fairly. Food justice represents a transformation of the current food system, including but not limited to eliminating disparities and inequity. And I think another particularly important point in the food justice definition is this idea of addressing hunger, which sometimes gets left out of the food desert conversation. And is very consistent with the food insecurity rates that we see in those same communities. We also have to consider the needs of all players. The corporate solution is one solution, but there's also stores within these communities that are important players and residents within these communities that are important players. In 2008, the DC Hunger Solutions conducted a survey in collaboration with the Food Trust to look at store owners within the community and some of their concerns. And store owners reported feeling a part of the community. And many owners were interested in investing in the future to provide healthier foods, but they faced challenges. Many stores were in need of capital improvements, outdated equipment. Store owners perceive that demand for produce at small stores is limited. They feel that their products reflect customer demand and the potentially high sales in beer, alcohol, and lottery. And I think there's the idea that we want to bring in corporate solutions and get rid of those stores, but I think it's important to look at both the challenges from the perspective of the community residents, but also the challenges from the perspective of the owners within those communities, as well as the corporate solutions. The Food Trust has a few recommendations for attracting local retail, and one of them is this idea of securing community support and having corporate accountability. And so even though we talk about the smaller stores and they've been under attack, we still need to remember when we bring in corporate solutions that they need to have some accountability as well. It may not look the same with the expired food, but there still may be an issue where the community is not being served. Okay, I have 5 minutes.